In this session, we will focus on the very important question about minimum wages. This is also a fast-growing research field, and our speaker, Professor Attila Linner, is a globally leading researcher within this field. Mr. Linner is a professor of economics at the University of College London, and he will, for 30 to 35 minutes, give a presentation, a non-technical presentation, based on a presentation he did for the European Labour Market Research community recently. And after that, there's a Q&A and a panel. And hopefully we finish a few minutes before 11:45, so you have the time for lunch. Thank you. The floor is yours.
All right, thank you. Is it working? Oh, perfect. Thank you so much for inviting me. This is a really fascinating conference, and I really enjoyed the first session, and I'm very much looking forward to the day. And I was asked to talk about minimum wages, which is something that you don't have, but you want to learn about it. So this is I will kind of give an overview what the literature, I think, or the state-of-the-art knowledge about it. And this is kind of based on a chapter that I wrote with Arjen Dubé, my co-author on many projects. So minimum wage is an interesting thing because most of the countries today have some form of minimum wages. So this is just a map of the world, and basically with the black are the countries which, according to the ILO, doesn't have minimum wage. You can see that there is like Antarctica here, which is an unexplored territory where we didn't enter the labor movement. Sorry? It's a little bit further. Yeah, okay, thank you. And then, you know, there are some countries in Africa, usually places with civil war. And there is some European countries which, of course, you have wage floors. So it's kind of like a minimum wage, but somehow it's not the same as a nationally set minimum wage that across the board apply. But, you know, you could count those have some form of substitute, maybe, as we learned today morning, even better substitute. And you know, if you get those on board, you see that there is literally a few handful of countries without a minimum wage. So this is something that like now everywhere. So this is important to study. And there is also greater and greater interest to use this policy more and more. So if you look at the United States, there it's a little bit more complicated picture, and I will talk more about it. But if you just look at, for instance, the movements for minimum wages at the city level, you will have 5 cities who have minimum wages in 2010, and you have more than 40 cities in 10 years later. Okay, so this is a really big, and then more and more cities are pushing for having their own minimum wage policies. There are countries which are introducing minimum wages, like Germany is the biggest example here. We were talking about United Kingdom, which is basically the conservative government decided to have one of the highest minimum wage among the OECD countries. A country which is traditionally fighting for, you know, kind of deregulating the labor market is kind of using as a major tool now. And there is also, like, you could see like what the major international organizations are thinking about the minimum wage. So in the 2012 report, they kind of say statutory minimum wage at the appropriate level is a good policy. Okay, so they kind of pushing every countries to apply this policy, and you know, of course, we will talk about this appropriate level meaning, because that's kind of an open question, but still, you know, there is a desire to have a minimum wage. Now, let me just start with a brief history about minimum wages and what is the motivation behind minimum wages. Okay, now it turns out that, you know, if you're talking about the policy, why minimum wage is applied is varying a lot across space and time. So there's the number one motivation was at the beginning of the policy was about avoiding to race to the bottom competition. Okay, and this is relevant for UK. UK has a minimum wage, very early introduction, but then they repealed it. New Zealand was the first country to introduce it, but even in the context of the United States, when they introduced the federal minimum wage, this kind of avoid to race to the bottom competition was a major factor. And the basic idea is that you don't want to have industries or businesses that basically competing to low labor standards. And you could this was kind of part of a bigger movement of saying like we don't allow child labor, we don't allow slavery, we don't allow certain type of business practices, and part of it was like saying like we also introduce minimum wage standards. And this kind of protection of in industries, and in the context of the United States, it was interstate commerce between the higher paying northern part of the United States and the lower paying southern part. They basically reflected specific, in the beginning, tradable occupations. Like it was industries like textile industry was one of the main regulated industry, which is really reflected this kind of like, this is a tradable sector, and we want to avoid race to the bottom competition across, north and south in the United States or different parts of the country. Now, over time, this kind of role seems to be diminishing, but now it's getting back when we're talking about the European Union Directive of Minimum Wages. This is some of the reason that they often mention that, if you want to have one labor market, then you want to have minimal social standard as well. Otherwise, there is a kind of race to the bottom competition. So the second most important thing is about increasing workers' welfare. So it turns out this is not how it started. So the first movements for minimum wages was not really about that, but then it's taking over, and today is basically one of the most important reasons why we want to have minimum wages, basically trying to increase the living standards at the bottom of the wage distribution. This was more pivotal role in the Europe when minimum wage was introduced, and it was parallel with the welfare state movements. Many countries like France, they wanted to develop a welfare state, and parallel this process, they wanted to set labor standards. And basically, if you look at the media or the discussion of the policies, this is now the number one concern. Is minimum wages a good tool to increase workers' welfare? Is it good to increase inequality? And we will collect, I will tell you the evidence on that in a second. And then the third reason, which is often mentioned in relations to minimum wage, is the political economic consideration. So the first two was more economic consideration. This is about the political economy, and this was particularly relevant in the Latin American context, where basically like unions are often was quite radical movement against the state, in general. And the state intervention labor relationship was very important from the state perspective to trying to drive away workers from the union. So the idea of the setting like minimum wages is like the state wanted to regulate the labor market and take the wind out of the sails of a union and kind of trying to weaken them. Now, I think this is also relevant in the European context, and probably it's relevant in the context of the Nordic countries, that once unions became quite weak, they kind of supporting the minimum wage policies. If the unions are strong, then they often against introducing a nationwide minimum wage that's set by the government or enacted by the legislations of the government, because that kind of creates some kind of political conflict between them. Okay. Now, so what are the recent trends? So here I just show a few major countries in the level of minimum wages. So what, I could talk 50 minutes about this graph, but I don't want to just have this talk about that. So what we show here over time for a few countries, the minimum wage to the average wage. So what is it? This is what people often use to compare minimum wages across time and space. Basically, if you just take the level of the minimum wage, then it's kind of hard to compare across countries, because a $10 minimum wage or €10 minimum wage in Germany versus €10 minimum wage in Slovakia would mean very different things, because just the average wages are very different in the two countries and the productivity. So people usually try to normalize minimum wages to the average wage, and so that's what we do. And so just a few patterns that I want to highlight you, that for instance, like the European countries are almost all of them now have a very ambitious minimum wage policies. So you can see UK is going up here. You can see Germany is going is starting from here, going up here. You can see Spain has a big minimum wages going up here. So even though they started from a different level, but now they are quite ambitious minimum wage policies. On the other hand, the United States has quite ambitious high-level minimum wages at the beginning of the 70s and 80s, but now it's kind of degraded down, and it's one of the lowest over time historically. And there are some, and you can see two lines. So in parallel with that, some states started to introduce minimum wages, which creates like, this is like when I also take into account that certain part of the United States has higher minimum wage, but still it's quite far below the European one, even if I take this into account. And China is also a country which has a very high minimum wage when it was introduced in the mid-90s, but now it's kind of very low with the United States. So this kind of thing that I tell you, that minimum wage is more and more ambitious, is not shared across the globe. Okay, in certain parts of the globe, in fact, big parts of the globe, the two biggest powers in the world are kind of seems to be doesn't want to increase their minimum wages. So in the United States context, the federal one haven't been changed now almost for a decade. Okay, so but you know, as an economic researcher, we want to understand what's the implications of minimum wage policies. I want to evaluate, is it a good policy or a bad policy? And the most important first question to answer this: what are the wage and the employment effects of the policy? Okay. Now, within this review paper that I mentioned we're trying to understand various margins of adjustment, and you know, we kind of trying to collect all the evidence that had been produced in the last 25, 30 years in the academic literature, and trying to summarize what we think is the best, what the evidence suggests. Now, the first effect is like, what is the effect on wages and fringe benefits? Is minimum wage increasing wages? That's the first question. That's what, you know, whether there is enough compliance or not. And the answer is yes. What we see that when minimum wage is increasing, those people who are affected by the policy, they indeed experience a large wage increase. And non-compliance, in fact, is very limited in most of the contexts which we see. Even in the developing economic context where there is not good formal institutions, we see quite substantial compliance to the policy. So it's not just about enforcement. In fact, it's unlikely to be just about the performance. We think that the evidence suggests when the minimum wage raises, it kind of shifts expectations, reserve wage and wages, and fairness on the labor market, and that affects how firms can set wages afterwards. So this is number one. So the number two is whether, okay, you know, this is minimum wages, the state usually only regulates the level of the wage. So it's possible that you raise the wage, but there is an offsetting effect by cutting other fringe benefits, or in the context of the United States, healthcare provision, private healthcare provision, or, you know, like you introducing some not so good work features that cuts costs for the firm, but bad for the workers. So there is a considerable amount of empirical literature trying to understand whether there is this offsetting effect of the policy. And what we conclude, that most overwhelming majority of the evidence suggests that there is not really a big offset. If anything, might be a small offset, but that could be like explaining 10% of the wage increase. So there is a 10% increase in the wage and maybe 1% decline in kind of provision of private healthcare in the United States. So there is not clear. There is a clear indication that basically after the minimum wage introduced, not just wages increase, but the job quality. Okay, so these people who are sitting at these jobs seems to be happier. They seems to be like those jobs better, and the turnover of those jobs decreasing. They're less likely to leave those jobs. So there is a clear indication that quality and the wages are goes hand in hand. Okay. So the second effect, okay, so wages increase, quality of the jobs improves. Now the problem, of course, is that there might be disemployment effect. And there could be many reasons, and economics like a long list of reasons why we think there could be disemployment effect. In fact, we spend all of our research on trying to, oh yeah, there is bad stuff happening. So, you know, there could be like some business go bust because of the minimum wage. There could be some substitution to other inputs, like the firms will hire more high-skilled workers or capital or automation. And there could be, you know, because firms need to pass through to the cost, maybe there will be a reduction of scale of production, because when prices increasing, consumer need to switch. Okay, so there could be many reasons, but the question is this happening or not? So to discuss this, I have to introduce something that helps me to compare estimates across studies. And that's what we call this own wage elasticity. And it sounds like maybe a little bit complicated, but it's a very simple concept. So it's just measure the percentage change in employment relative to the percentage change in wage induced by the minimum wage. Okay? So why is it good? It's good because then I can calculate it for every studies that has been produced in the literature, and I can summarize what is this number, and I can compare across studies. Now, what this own wage elasticity means, let me just give you 3 examples to explain. Okay. So let's suppose own wage elasticity is -1. That would imply that if I increase 10% wages, the minimum wage increase 10%, the wages, then there will be a 10% reduction in employment. Okay, so that's quite big. Okay, own wage -1, it's quite a big. That means that the total low wage income collected by the low wage workers, in fact, is unaffected. It's changed by 0%. Okay, so on the one hand, I increase 10% wages. That's good for the workers to keep their job, but 10% of the workers will lose the job. So at the end of the day, there will be winners and losers among low-skilled workers, and overall, the average guy is not made better, and there will be increase in inequality. So this, I would say, like if that's the territory, I would say the minimum wage is not a good policy. Okay. Now, what about if it's tenths of that? Okay, it's still negative, it's -0.1, but it's tenths of the size. Then it means that 10% increase in a wage lead to 1% reduction in employment. Okay. Now that would imply that, you know, there is some leakage, some job loss because of the minimum wage, but that's small. So if I just take all the average low wage worker guy, their income is still increasing by 9%. Okay? So then, you know, many policymakers would argue that, you know, that might be like a small cost for a big benefit, and, you know, it's not clear that you cannot really go down to this, shrink this, or you can somehow bring them, those people, by training or other programs. Okay, so if that's the own wage elasticity, then, you know, you would there is some trade-off, but I would still, probably most people would argue that it's still a good policy. Now it's possible that the own wage elasticity is positive. Okay, which is kind of counterintuitive for now classical economists, but just Ellen Manning give a talk which kind of highlight that it's possible in the monopsony world. Then you have a 10% increase in wages lead to 5% increase in employment. That's a win-win. Everything is better off, and the total low wage income increasing by 15%. So that's awesome. Okay, that's like the best of the world. Okay, so these are the magnitudes that we can look for. So what we did in our studies, we tried to look all the papers that we can calculate this own wage elasticity in the US literature, and we didn't do any weighting. We don't do say like, oh, we like this study or we like the other study. You know, we just take that's the body of evidence that has been produced so far. Okay, and this is just showing the own wage elasticity that I kind of introduce you across all these studies. So this shows how many studies we have. Like this is quite large negative. We have like 5 of these studies around among the 80 studies that we find. And then you can see that basically most of the studies in the literature is around this relatively modest employment change. You know, some of them is negative, small negative, some of them is small positive, but that's the overwhelming majority of the studies that are there. And these are economics papers, so this is like, you know, the profession is against the minimum wage, so I would be quite surprised. I was quite surprised to see this. There are some quite large positive effects, and there are some quite large negative effects, but, you know, kind of a similar magnitude. And then if you just take the median own wage elasticity is -0.1. Okay, so just the median US study, or across US and other European countries, studies suggest that it's kind of a very modest negative effect, maybe, but if any, but it's small. Now we can also look at some case studies. So the problem with this, of course, that some of these studies can vary in methodology. Some of the studies have better methodology than others. So we can also look at like case studies of which are, you know, kind of very successful papers in the literature that studies recently the effect of minimum wage. So one of the case studies, the United States. So this is kind of this is just a map of the United States, and you can see there's lots of state level variation in the United States in the level of minimum wages, which is growing recently. So there is more and more, like now 32 states have different level of minimum wages, which is very nice. So this creates a very nice laboratory to study the effect of the minimum wage. I can have states which introduce the minimum wage and compare to these similar states but didn't introduce the minimum wage, and I can look at them over time, before and after, and this creates a really nice case study. Now it turns out that if you look at the last 40 years, we kind of, with my co-authors, we identify 60 big, large US minimum wage changes. Many of them happened quite recently, in fact, like half of them, but there are 60 in the whole periods that we can study from the 80s, and we can look at how a minimum wage, how an average minimum wage among these 60s affect the labor market. So to do that, we kind of produce this graph, which is just show how does the minimum wage, an average minimum wage in the United States context, affect the wage distribution. And so what you can see here is the level of the minimum wage. This is the new minimum wage. This is 0. And then you can see that below the new minimum wage, there are, relative to the control states which didn't introduce the minimum wage, there are some missing jobs in the wage distribution. Okay, so these are the jobs which was below the new minimum wage. So because of the minimum wage, you cannot really employ them. Okay, you cannot really employ them, and you see that we see these missing jobs. Now, what can happen with these jobs? They can disappear. Okay, they can go to unemployment. That's the job loss, or they can show up as an excess job and the distribution, and that's what we see here. Okay, so there is this excess jobs at above the new minimum wage. So this is like all these jobs that were here swept up to the new minimum wage. Okay, creating these excess jobs. Okay, and then you can see that there's nothing happening in the upper part of the wage distribution, which is nice because it suggests that there was no other big shocks taking place when these average minimum wages are introduced. Okay, now you can calculate what's happening at the bottom of the wage distribution. I can add the missing jobs below the new minimum wage and the excess jobs above the new minimum wage, and then I can calculate what is the implied on wage elasticity. And in the United States context, I kind of find like a positive 0.41 for these shocks. So it's it means that in the context of the United States, it's quite a good policy. Now it's a little bit, I don't know why it gets smaller, but there's some uncertainty around the estimates, so I cannot rule out negative effects, but I can definitely rule out modest negative effects from the effect of minimum wage. Okay. Okay, the United Kingdom. That's another case study. I think it's very interesting because it has a very ambitious minimum wage policy since 2019. Since 2015, and then you can see there's this large increase, and now basically one of the highest paying OECD countries in terms of the minimum wage. So we see exactly the same similar study that the United States, but here we compared exposed locations to least exposed locations and tried to understand in those locations where are more exposed to minimum wage, do we see differential employment effect versus those locations that are less exposed to minimum wage? And if this is a similar picture as before, so we have some missing jobs, but there are equal size excess jobs, and then you can see some spillover effects here, which is which you have to add them up to see the magnitudes. And if you do the overall job loss, you get like a small negative effect. Okay, this is a little bit more imprecise, unfortunately. But look, if you look at the point estimate, it still suggests that if anything, there might be a small disemployment effect, but it's unlikely to be large. Now we can also look at Germany, which is the other country which introduced the minimum wage, and we thought an interesting place to study because that country didn't have a minimum wage and then it's introduced, so it's kind of like a big shock for many of the firms. So this is in the context of Germany, where basically from the mid-90s there was quite a big weakening of the unions, and what happened is that this basically increased the inequalities so much that many of the German unions switched to kind of supporting the minimum wages, And in 2015, basically they agreed with the coalition government between the Social Democrats and the Conservative Party agreed to introduce a minimum wage. So this was a minimum wage which was binding. Quite many people were affected by that. We kind of 15% of the workforce are directly affected by had wages below the new minimum wage. So this was a highly binding policy. And what we find there, that basically wages increased quite substantially. There was no employment reduction. If anything, we see a slight increase in employment. And what's really interesting is that this kind of relatively limited employment effect masked some interesting underlying changes in the structure of the low-wage labor markets. So we find what we call worker reallocation, which meant that following the policy change, there was a movement for smaller to larger firms, from lower to higher paying firms, so those firms which are paying low premium versus higher premium, and from less to more productive firms. So what the policy did basically was kind of created this kind of allocation of labor, which is, by the way, also present, which is also what you would expect to get in the framework like Ellen Manning presented in the monopolistic labor market, that basically the most inefficient firms exit the market, but the firms which are paying higher above them can absorb this workforce and then it can grow, and then this kind of improve the production efficiency allocation of the workers. So we find something very interesting, finding that is very much in line with this imperfect competition notions of the labor market. On the regional effects, we find that those places that are really highly affected by the minimum wage, like Eastern Germany, there is improved establishment quality in terms of higher productivity per worker and higher firm wage premium. Okay, so we kind of find like this kind of positive effects of the policy. All right, so what we can conclude? So basically, even though there could be many mechanisms underlying this kind of negative disemployment effect, if we look at the body of the literature, we don't find significant reduction in employment. Okay, in fact, what this implies is that there is a big increase in the total low wage collected by the workers, which is kind of highlighting the positives of the policy in terms of the worker perspective. Now, of course, there is a natural next question emerge. Okay, if the low wage workers get lots of income, who pays for it? Like what is the incidence of it? And we have a long list of mechanisms that could bear the incidence, and here I just kind of want to highlight one of the few often mentioned ones. So one of them is that, okay, so if the low wage workers' wage increase, then it's paid by the higher wage workers, they get like a wage cut, okay? So then the other could be that it goes to the firm owners. Okay, there is an increase in wages, now the firm's profits decrease, and that's how the minimum wage is absorbed, okay? Then it could be the suppliers. So I'm a firm, you know, I'm hiring minimum wage workers, but I can kind of pass it through the suppliers. This could be the landowners. Like if I'm a retail store at the high street, you know, I'm hiring, I'm paying a rent on, basically to rent this place, and then minimum wage increase means now the land price, the retail store price will decrease, so I'm paying less of a rent. Okay, but it could be also like suppliers of other firms. Then it could be to pass through to consumers in forms of higher prices. And it could also mean that I'm just simply reorganizing my production and I'm, you know, I'm more efficient. So what we find is that, you know, the first route channel is not very important. Okay? We don't find any evidence for wage retrenchment. In fact, the opposite is true. When the minimum wage increase, we see there is some spillovers on higher skilled workers. And even if we go higher up in the wage distribution, we don't see like negative wage cuts at the top. Now, we also find no real indication of significant reduction in profits. It's a little bit mixed evidence in the literature, I would say. There is also fewer studies, like there is already 6-7 studies, and it's growing, so every day there is a new study added. but most of the evidence suggests no or very limited disemployment effect for the firm owners, which is quite surprising because, you know, in the standard labor capital fights relationship, it's kind of, if the labor gets more, the firm owners get less kind of story that dominates. Now, what we don't find much indication for pass-through to suppliers or rents or lowering rents, but I would say that like there's a little evidence on this. The two most important channels is the fourth and the fifth. So we find that significant portion, around 80% of the minimum wage increase, is passed through to consumers through higher prices. Okay, so it's kind of like consumer seems to be the one who bore the incidence of the minimum wages. And there is also some evidence and more evidence of improving efficiency. Okay, some of this efficiency improvement is just improved management. Like in response to the shock, firms need to find the better solutions, like make the workers more efficient. It comes from lowering turnover of the worker. So basically, like we find strong indication that minimum wage decreased turnover, worker turnover, and that leads like longer employment and worker relationship and more training at the firm potentially. And you know, that improves efficiency. And there is also a better allocation, like I mentioned this German case, that, you know, some of the inefficient firms are exited the market, and the most efficient firms could kind of expand and increase their share. So this definitely playing a role, and we have more and more indication that there are significant margins of adjustment. Okay. All right. I think I'm running out of time, so let me just conclude. So, you know, we have in the last century, we kind of debated about whether we should have a minimum wage at all, whether it's a good or bad policy. But I think the state-of-the-art evidence suggests that, you know, if anything, there's a limited disemployment effect, and there are significant earnings gains. There are significant benefits of the policy. Of course, with the caveat that is always true on certain levels and in certain economic contexts. So it could be that in some cases this is not the case, but many of the studies which we see across the globe, including many developed countries from Europe, in the United States, and including many developing countries, we find that the economic context holds for having a minimum wage policy that in fact creates more benefits than cost. Now, of course, the open question that we have a relatively little, what is the appropriate level of the minimum wage and where is the turning point in the effects of the minimum wage? And this is where we need to accumulate more knowledges. And I just want to highlight some of the things that we have now working with my co-authors in the context of the United States. So here I'm just showing you a graph which showing all the 60 large minimum wage events. Each dot is a large minimum wage event from the United States context. So this is, for instance, Hawaii 2015 started to increase the minimum wage. This is Massachusetts 2015, and this is showing the size of the minimum wage. So this is like the minimum wage relative to the average wage. So this is what we call the Kites index in the literature. Sorry, I couldn't change this here. So this is like higher minimum wage relative to the average wage in the economy on the x-axis. And this is what do we see? What is the change in the log wage? Okay, and you see some, you know, scatter plots. There are some noise in the data. Okay, but you can see a clear relationship when the minimum wage is more binding. So we are in that range. We see larger wage effects. Okay, that's what we expect. No, like where more and more people are affected by the minimum wage, the wage increase is larger. This is the more interesting part, the change in employment, and you can see that, you know, basically there is a big noise around it, but once you move to the highest minimum wage levels, we don't see there is a negative disemployment effect. So this, you know, many economists will predict this is go downward. Okay, like we start to increase the minimum wage, and then we get to here where, you know, there is wage effect, but there is large disemployment effect. But in the United States context, where the minimum wage is around 60%, the Kites index, we don't find an indication of that. If anything, we see an upward slope. So we kind of still in the upward trajectory. Okay, so this kind of highlights that, you know, at least based on the U.S. evidence, we didn't reach the turning point. Okay, in response to minimum wage, so we need to go further to go down here. Then, okay. And just one more. So many reasons why European context is quite interesting, because Europe is started to reach here, and there are more and more evidence accumulated there, and we could use that. But in the United States, that's the farthest we can go. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. Very, very clear. A few questions.
Okay.
Let's say this new interest from in the UK, in the US, and Germany, is it research-driven, or is it more policy-driven, or is it a combination? Why is it now?
I think it's. I think more and more politicians recognizing that minimum wage is a quite cheap tool to introduce. It makes politicians popular. You know, you can kind of like say like I raise the living, like and basically like it's kind of it's a free policy. Yeah. You know, there is very little budget consequence of that. If there is no disemployment effect, in fact zero, yeah. Or in fact positive, because there is a higher wage, they pay higher taxes. So many politicians recognize the relatively cheap tool. In fact, if you look at in the context of the United States, some of the reason why it's not so popular, it's still like there are some conservative support from small businesses which really have a high lobby power, okay. And they influence the politics. But if you get the general population, whenever there's a ballot, and basically in Florida there was a ballot on minimum wages, they passed easily. All the states which have ballot, it's passed easily, the minimum wage regulation. Mm. So it's basically like it's a quite popular policy. So if a politician wants to get popularity, I think it's a good way to push it. And it's happened with the conservative government, like George Osborne, who was you know, one of the leading figure of austerity measures after the great recession, basically was introducing the minimum wage, and part of the reason was that, like, look, it's a policy that unlikely to cause lots of harms in the economy, and it's just I can use it to weaken the opposition, the labor government, and
but this policy focus then is based on this new research. I guess the conventional wisdom was another story, was it?
I think, you know, definitely research helps. Yeah. I just listened to the discussion previously, the previous panel. Somebody mentioned a paper about layoff notice and the effects of this on employment, which I found very fascinating. That, you know, academic research can reach the highest level of the politics. Yeah. You know, definitely like the fact that in the early 90s, the emergence of papers claiming that the disemployment effects are limited, I'm pretty sure helped the policymakers, you know, bigger support for the policy among the policymakers. I think, you know, now probably if you go to a meeting and, you know, you evaluate, like, let's a policy proposal, many of the studies would, like the policy report would say, like, you know, it's unlikely that the minimum wage will have large disemployment effects, so there will be no negative consequences, and it's more likely that a politician will sign up to it, I think. Sure. So definitely I think the research has an influence in that way.
Okay, thanks. Second question is related to this reallocation aspect. As I see it, earlier research on this topic didn't include this reallocation effect. You just looked at how many lose their job because of the wage increase.
Yep.
But now you also add what happens to those people. Is that the correct interpretation?
I think it's a correct interpretation. So this kind of reallocation effects has been not explored in the past. So most of the economics literature has been focusing on the employment effects, overall employment effects of the policy, and there's very little understanding of, like, what type of firms people are employed after the policy. And this is partly like Alan Manning's introduction on the imperfect competition. For many, you know, if there are no rents on the labor market, like as a neoclassical model predicts, there is no reason you want to look at firms' allocation.
No.
Once rents emerge, then you start to ask the question, okay, then I'm interested about what type of firms surviving this policy. Is it the firms that pay high rents, or is it the firms low rents? And how does the composition of the firms changing? and whether the surviving firms are those firms which are offering higher rents to begin with. And in fact, now this paper that I mentioned you in German context is also have been replicated in the United States context, where they have been looking at like state level variation in the restaurant sector, and they find very similar pattern. That in response to minimum wage, there is no disemployment effect. Some small restaurant businesses exit the market, but the remaining businesses are the most efficient ones can grow and absorb all the labor that disappear. Now, it's also implied that if you look at things at the firm level, then you can find this employment effect, you know. But if you look at the market level, then those kind of disappearing because of this reallocation mechanism.
I think that reallocation aspect is really important for us in Sweden, because we think that we have a model pushing up wages, leading to structural change and so forth. But it has not been studied in Sweden either. So I think it's important to add that dimension of it. But another question is, do you have any thoughts about wages in itself pushing up productivity in firms, because it becomes cheaper to invest in capital? Have you done any research on that?
I mean, that kind of story of like one of the improvements on the efficiency margin, I think it suggests that when you push up wages, at least at the bottom, then you find this improvement efficiency. Okay. So this kind of improving the productivity of the firms. Now, of course, how much you can generalize this to the overall economy, that's a different question, okay? But, you know, what I see in the minimum wage literature in the last I would say the last 5 years, there's more and more recognition how much, many economists got quite surprised by how much efficiency improvements people find in these studies. Which is highlighting that, you know, the link between wage and productivity is not as clear as many economics. So then, you know, we could come up many stories why this is happening, but we know that there are lots of inefficiencies in management, and, you know, like a higher level of minimum wage can push better management practices. Yes. And if you ask like survey of employers about like what do they think, how would they react to minimum wage, it turns out they often mention that in fact we would they often not mentioning like displacing workers, but they kind of saying like we want to find ways to improve productivity basically as a major mechanism to respond to the minimum wage. So it's not just the empirical academic studies, but also manager surveys seems to be confirming that this is there. Okay,
thank you. The last question before we introduce the panel, but. I mean, in the Nordic countries, for example, the labor force participation rate and the employment rate among the low educated and the weak groups are higher than in many other countries. So is it the case that reasonably high minimum wages also push people to the labor market, and it becomes less attractive to do something else? Are there any research on that?
Yeah, so that's an interesting question. So this is one margin of adjustment that we have been looking how much minimum wage itself affects participation in the labor market. Yeah, we don't find a strong indication for that in this. I mean, I would say there are 3 studies in the U.S. context. Those 3 studies doesn't paint a picture of like that higher minimum wage increased significantly the participation rate. Okay. There is one evidence recently, I want to propagate it because it's done with my student, my PhD student, who has a job now, which I'm very proud of. He kind of finds some increase in job search behavior among the youngest people, so the teenage and the young adults. He finds that in response to minimum wage, they increase the job search. But that's kind of restricted to this younger population. If you look at the overall, we don't find much indication. For the young teenagers, there seems to be some effects of this kind of mechanisms that you described.
Okay. Thanks for that. Then we invite the panels. Please come up here, Maria Kahonen, Charlotta Stern, och Thomas Carlén. Maria is a labor market researcher at Labore. Charlotta is a professor and CEO of Ratio Research Institute for the Swedish, close to the Swedish business. And Thomas Carlén is an economist at the LO, the Swedish Blue Collar Confederation. So, first, once again, just briefly give us some general thoughts about what you have heard from Mr. Linner. And I guess Maria from Finland, you are at Labore. What do you think?
Okay. Oh, thank you. Thank you for Professor Linner for a very interesting presentation. And well, I also read the paper, Minimum Wages in the 21st Century. And of course, in that paper, Professor Linner and his co-author give a very comprehensive review of the contemporary research on minimum wages and their impact on low-wage labor markets. So it was very interesting to find out so that there are, of course, there are implications and consequences for wages and employment, and then they are the main topics, but it was also interesting to look at the multifaceted implications of minimum wages, like how firms adjust to these higher labor costs due to higher minimum wages, so that like the mechanism of passing these higher costs to consumers as a higher prices, and also these impacts on productivity and efficiency. So they were very interesting. And also I should mention the impact of minimum wages, not only on those who get the minimum wages, but on the low wage structure, so that it was quite interesting to read about the spillover effects. It was very fascinating. And what I also should mention is of course the importance of empirical methods, so that you're emphasizing the quasi-experimental methods like differences and event studies, so that we need more robust evidence on the impact of minimum wages, and also the empirical methods and data. They are very important in this aspect. So very, very comprehensive, very nice presentation and paper. Thank you.
Thanks. Before I go to Lotta, Labore is a labor market research institute close to the Finnish labor unions. So you know that. But Charlotta, what was your first general thoughts?
Well, I'm a sociologist, so let me just say that I read and partake in this research sort of from the side, and I find it fascinating and very worthwhile. However, being a sociologist, I've never thought that markets were perfect. So for me, it's kind of like, really? Wow. So let me just share an observation that I made in sort of being on the sideline of economics. First, when I started grad school, theoretical model building and neoclassical economics was all the rage, and that was what counted. Now, at least in labor econ, empirical causal models and studying the data is all that matters. And to me, it's sort of an interesting trend, because it's like before it was all about theory and the model, and now it's like the theory's gone and now it's just the model, the empirical stuff. As being on the side, I'm kind of wondering now if you don't really throw out the baby with the bathwater, it's kind of like the swing has perhaps gone too far towards just like empiricism. So that's my observation. But on the other hand, I do think that this kind of studies are worth, I mean, very important. We need to understand what works and what doesn't work. We need to understand how reality works out there. And so I kind of welcome this development. I'm just a little bit, I'm just a little bit concerned because I do about the baby in the bathwater notion, and that is like, even if you accept that markets aren't perfect, markets are not 100% perfect competitive, there are rents, etc. there is something to the notion of neoclassical economics saying like, okay, when the price of something goes up, the demand goes down. And if we sort of forget that insight, I do think we're in trouble, because then we have no limits on how the market works. Yes. And even though it isn't perfect, it still is like a process that tends towards, you know, something.
Okay.
And so that would be my kind of reaction to the whole thing.
Thanks. I will come back to that later. But Thomas, your turn.
Yeah, thank you very much for the invitation, and thank you for a great, interesting presentation. I very much welcome this new research. I think it's excellent, and finally, because and I think it's great that the mainstream neoclassical economic theory is finally seriously challenged. I think most of us who work for a social partner, for a trade union or employers organization, we knew already that labor markets doesn't really work as that mainstream theory assumed. And now we can finally see research catching up with reality, and we can have more use of this kind of research than maybe we did with the classical studies. So I think this is starting of a new era in labor economics. I hope so. I think it's very interesting.
Thanks for that. I just want to... Okay, Attila, your reactions. What do you think?
I think the evidence is suggesting that there is something more than just a very simple perfect competition. Now, I don't say that the perfect competition predictions are all wrong. It's just you need a more nuanced view, and I think in this very long chapter that we wrote, we decided not to have a model, and the reason for that because we thought there is not a good model that could incorporate all this what we have. So and I think we need models. I don't think that we just need data. We have now a good understanding how does the reactions happening at this in the low wage labor market, but putting this together is not easy, and I think that's we also have to work on it, and there are some economists, unfortunately macroeconomists, working on it, which is never a good idea. But just putting aside that joke, they have a little bit like sometimes simplify things, you know. At the macro level it doesn't matter, but I think that's definitely something that we should do. And thanks for the compliment.
Then I go back to Charlotta then. Two questions actually. Is monopsony not a theory as you see it, or is it a wrong theory, or is it complementary, or?
Yeah. No, I do think that, I mean, I'm very convinced with the empirical evidence.
Yeah.
I mean, to me, it's more of a question of something that was started in Professor Lindner's presentation. We study the minimum wage, and we say that, oh, sometimes it doesn't have any negative effects on employment, and sometimes it boosts employment, and sometimes it creates all these dynamic effects. And I mean, that's all fine. I'm just like, there's a big caveat, I think, and the caveat is, where is the appropriate level? For one thing, I mean, how can you just raise it indefinitely, like everyone gets 1 million crowns? So it's a little bit like framing and scope. How much can we shift it, and what would the effect be if we're like continuing? Because I do think that over time we would see a decrease in employment. I think in certain areas of Sweden we already see that we have structural unemployment, and some people are priced out of the market. It's as simple as that. I mean, so there is market underneath here, even though it's not perfect.
Okay. Then I change perspective and go to Maria a little bit. What is the research and policy agenda in Finland on minimum wages? Do you have any debate or research on this?
Actually, we don't. The debate on minimum wages at the moment. So we got this EU minimum wage directive, but I think that in Finland, if we think about the minimum wages, whether we should have a national minimum wage, so that I think that the opinions from like employer and employee side labor market organizations is negative to national minimum wage. So we are like in other Nordic countries, to my understanding, we are in favor of these minimum wages that are set by collective agreements. So there are different minimum wages in different collective agreements. So
are there any studies on those in Finland? What is the effect in different agreements?
Of course, there is some studies on the levels of minimum wages set by collective agreements, but as such, I will go back to why labor market parties, social partners, thinks that it's good to have a collective minimum wages set by collective agreements. It's said that they provide flexibility. Yeah. It's easier to change the wage level, and the sectoral minimum wage floors take into account like sectoral circumstances better. And if we would have like a national minimum wage, it would say that we have some empirical evidence that when we have minimum wages set by collective agreement, the level is higher than the national minimum wages. Mm-hmm. This is like empirical evidence on this from different countries. So that if we would have like a national and one important factor, I think it is very important to emphasize in this context, is that when we have a very high collective bargaining coverage, and then we have a quite relatively high minimum wages set by these collective agreements, so we don't need national minimum wages as long as we have the protection brought by the high collective bargaining coverage. And in Finland, the general bindingness of collective agreements guarantees this, so that those who are in those sectors where there's a general binding collective agreements, also those unorganized firms, they also have to obey the take into account the minimum wages. So that this is a discussion concerning whether to have a national minimum wages or not. And then if you want to hear about the minimum wage research as such, so that there's a relatively little research on minimum wages. There have been some more recent studies studying these kind of reforms that took place in experiments that took place in the 1990s, so that firms could pay for young, newly hired workers sub-minimum wages, and what are there has been an exploitation of course the experimental designs on these, and whether they worked or not, whether they helped the young people, so that the result was from these studies was that actually the firms didn't pay sub-minimum wages because there were social norms that caused them costs. So quite a little research, empirical academic research on minimum wages as such. Yeah.
Okay. Then I go to Thomas and ask you, have LO been too cautious about the negative employment effects from increased minimum wages due to this new research?
Not in practice, I don't think so now, but maybe in rhetoric and debates and so on, we've been a bit defensive sometimes, I think.
Okay.
Our opponents, the employers' organizations and many economists in Sweden have used, among other things, high youth unemployment and more recently immigration and the supposed lack of low-skilled jobs as reasons to keep minimum wages low. Yeah. But I don't hear those arguments that often today, so maybe the tide has turned a bit. But LO in practice, no, but maybe in debates a bit defensive. Maybe.
But do you do any own research at LO on these issues, on different agreements you have?
Yes, we do. Not always academic research, but reports, of course. And we have some researcher at LO now that among other things, focus on wages and the social part, industrial relations and so on.
Okay. Thanks. Attila, you have any thoughts?
This is the lunchtime, no?
10 minutes.
All right. No, I don't have.
You don't have. Okay, then. Then I go to Charlotte again. In Sweden, we have the
A model. No. Sorry.
Default. Model.
In Sweden, we have a model. I was thinking you would say, no, I'm sorry.
In Sweden, we have the possibility of quite large subsidies for wage costs. So in introduktionsjobb, I guess it is 80% of the wage cost for 1 or 2 years. But despite that, it's not used. How come? Aren't firms rational? Because, I mean, you reduce the wage costs enormously, but it's not used.
I don't have a great answer for that.
Okay.
It's something that I hope to research in the future, because I find it surprising myself, of course.
Yeah.
There has to be some kind of inertia, or, you know, otherwise there has to be some kind of skill mismatch that makes it so that even at a heavily subsidized wage, people aren't interested in hiring you.
Yeah.
And we need to figure out exactly what's going on there. Or if it's like bureaucratic hurdles or, you know, whatever. If it's like stigma that you don't really want to attach your firm with these outsiders. I don't, you know, there's probably a little bit of everything, but we do need more research actually looking into the firm perspective on this, because I think that's lacking in Sweden.
Yeah. But some argue that the minimum wages cannot be such a problem in Sweden if the firms have this possibility of 80% subsidy.
Sure.
They could choose that, but they don't do it.
I mean, at the same time, we have one of the major problems for Swedish firms, of course, is that they can't find the kind of people they would like to hire.
Yeah.
So, I mean, when we interview firms in industry, they say one of their largest growth limiting factors is that they can't actually hire people. So they have to turn down jobs.
Yeah.
And so, you know, there is something seriously wrong with the matching in the Swedish labor market.
Yes.
And we need to figure out exactly, you know, I mean, we need to figure out more about what is happening here, I think.
Are you running any project on that, or?
We're hoping to. We're working on. We're starting up a project this summer about outsiders and competency, and so I'm hoping that we're going to start with the literature review and then see what happens.
Okay.
Because, you know, I don't know everything that's going on.
No. Okay.
Yet. No.
Yeah.
I'm just kidding.
How high are the minimum wages in the collective agreements in Sweden today?
I know the answer because I actually looked it up. Yeah, so they vary. They vary between 18,000 to 30.
Yeah.
So there's a big spread in minimum wages, and they cover about half of the collective agreements.
Yes.
So it's interesting to note that half of the collective agreements in Sweden do not have minimum wages. Of course, we could think that's the engineers and the.
But for Atla, for example, we have around 700 collective agreements, and 250 of those have minimum wages. But within each agreement, there are differences in terms of age, education, experience. So in practice, there are thousands, maybe. So it's really difficult to get a broad view of it, even though you can look at separate agreements. Because when I started to read on this a couple of years ago, the saying was that the minimum wages in Sweden are so high. And if you compare to UK today, like 25 or 26,000 Swedish krona. And in Sweden, in my agreement at the white collar place, is 22. And local municipalities is also 22, 23. And then you have the subsidies. So have we been too cautious again?
Well, I heard about this 2/3 of the median, and I started calculating what would 2/3 of the median wage in Sweden be, and it turns out that it's 24,000,
Yes.
and that is actually the mode in the collective agreements. So if you look at the minimum wages in the collective agreements, the most common minimum wage, according to the National Mediation Institute, is 24,000. So, I don't know. Maybe 18,000 is too low. Maybe that could be raised and without any employment cost. That's an empirical question, I think.
But if it
it's
increases,
an interesting empirical question.
But if it increases employment, the wage sum can still increase. So even though you have some losses, the gain is bigger. So you don't have to only look at the numbers, but also the people, but also the total wage sum, I guess.
I'm also curious about consumer prices going up, because I think that could perhaps eat up the benefit of having a wage hike.
Yes.
I mean, so there's a lot of research that needs to be done, I think.
So for the consumer prices, there are a few studies trying to understand which consumers borne the incidence, and they kind of equally shared in the economy. So you can think of this like the low wage people get a big boost, and then overall all consumers in the society pay for it. It's also clear that at least in the United States context, the consumers who get the benefits, they usually spend not on minimum wage produced goods, but more durable goods and some other stuff. So it's clear that those low wage people are substantially
improving lives,
benefiting from it, and that's kind of shared across the society.
If you have any questions, are there any mics here? Just think about them, and this time I will return to the questions. But just one short to Charlotta.
Yep.
You just published a paper from some colleagues of yours measuring the urban pay gap.
Yeah, Martin Korpi och Daniel Halvarsson.
Yes. That was the topic that Manning also mentioned briefly. But in that paper, they say that Sweden doesn't seem to be different from other comparable countries, which means that it seems like we have a great deal of monopsony if we compare urban to rural areas in terms of wages, controlling for productivity. Was that surprising for you?
No, I live in Stockholm. One of their findings is that there's a large city wage premium. There's also a large city housing cost thing. It doesn't surprise me at all, I think. Because I don't actually have the assumption that markets are perfect.
No.
So it's kind of so there's
Thomas?
So there's more competition for labor in Stockholm.
Thomas, do you have any comment on that research? Have you read it or?
No, I haven't seen it. No, I'm sorry.
It's
I will.
I'll send you the link.
Just comment from Finland regarding this, that if we see a wage premium in Stockholm area, in Finland there's a collective agreements, there might be these minimum wages, there might be higher minimum wages for the capital region in some collective agreements, so that they are taken into account higher living costs and everything. So that's also the variety by job title, by job experience, by region, like capital region and other regions. So
interesting.
Yeah.
So any questions from the floor? 1, 2. I can start over there.
Hi, Victor Munkhammar. I'm a journalist with Dagens Industri, a business daily for Attila. The wage increase was absorbed mainly by higher inflation, but also by higher productivity. You would assume, theoretically, that an employer would try to maximize productivity, whatever the wage level was, because that would increase profits. So I'm thinking, what's the mechanism here? Is it that with a higher wage, you could attract other types of employees? Is it that capital becomes relatively cheaper as wages increase? Or is theory just wrong and they were happy with a certain level of profit and now they need to do something to keep that level? Thank you.
Okay, that's a super interesting question. I would say two things to keep in mind. So first, you kind of assume that they are efficient employers. So I think there are more and more evidence that many of the businesses are not super efficient as we assume, like marginal product equals marginal revenue and optimization and everything. So there is a very interesting recent study in the United States context where basically there is one firm introducing a voluntary minimum wage. It's a big store across the whole United States with every state has like 50 stores, and they kind of introduce a voluntary minimum wage across the whole United States. They have to pay higher wage. And in certain locations, this is not binding. In California, San Francisco, they already paid higher wage. But in many locations, like Louisiana, in fact, it was a huge wage shock, okay? And what they found is that, and it was also surprised the firm owners, the businesses, that where they introduced this higher voluntary minimum wage, there was so big improvement in efficiency that in fact they paid for the cost itself. Now, you could say like this is a big store, and you know, why is it big? Because it's efficient and everything, but even this huge company has lots of inefficiencies, or maybe they have lots of inefficiencies because it's huge, I don't know. But you can see how much clunkiness are happening, that it's kind of fully paid for the cost for them. Now this is when you only one firm introducing the shock, but then could be also minimum wages doing that everybody had affected by the same shock. Okay, so everybody has to raise wages. And you know, this could affect on the turnover, like worker turnover between firms could decrease. And that might be beneficial, you know. If only one firm increasing, maybe they don't get the benefit, but every firm's increasing, there could be a decrease in turnover across the whole market, and the firms know now it's not so easy to switch to another firm maybe, or you know, then I can invest more to the worker, I can make it more productive. I don't have to worry always that, you know, working 4 months and leaving it me, because, you know, if I know that turnover generally lower, I can rearrange the business, and that could increase efficiency, okay? And then you could have a third factor as well, that some of the inefficient businesses existed, and they took away consumers from me, or they kind of, labor was just hanging there without not doing much, and they didn't know there is a better job opportunity or something like that. And if I'm a firm raising the wage, they might not learn about me, you know. Now only the higher wage firms can survive, so the workers will go toward that. So there could be some market level effects on efficiency that is not you can get as a firm if I'm just doing it alone. So, and I think, you know, it's open question which one of the individual inefficiencies or the market level one is, what is the magnitude between the two. I would say, you know, probably the market level dominates, but I'm an economist, you know, I always like assume every firm is optimizing, but you know, it's an open question how much, but both of them is probably pretty crucial.
Thanks. Second question.
Thank you. Jon Erik Dølvik from FAFO in Oslo. One theme I was wondering why has not been brought up in this context where we speak about Nordic models where collective bargaining have used to set all-encompassing wage floors. Because when we have a more international labor market and unionization and collective bargaining coverage is going down, actors have to look for ways to compensate that. In Norway, we have a much lower union density. In private sector, it's 38%. Wow. Collective bargaining coverage is 47%. And with the huge influx of, let's say, flexible, low-paid European labor over recent years, there has been a spread of, the wage floors have broken up. So we have had a spread of low-wage competition. What has been done in Norway and is done as explained in Finland and also in Iceland is to have the mechanism of extending collective agreement minimum terms. And I wonder both why this is not more a topic in Sweden and whether you will go into looking into that way of setting wage floors, which is more common in Europe than the statutory minimum wage. I mean, you have it in France, you have it in Netherlands, Belgium, and so on and so forth. And that's a way of bolstering the regulating power.
But the question is extending agreements to make sure that everyone gets the pay.
Yes.
Yes.
Issue for Sweden, issue for research.
Yes. Okay, Thomas, Sweden.
No, that's not a debate about that at all, I would say. Among blue-collar workers, the collective agreement coverage is 90%, if you look at the total economy, including the public sector. And in those sectors where we do not yet have collective agreements, we are trying to get it. So that's our way of doing it. And the social partners generally do not want politicians or legislators to intervene in wage formation at all. So this means that extending it like that will be a violation to tradition. But you never know, if things get worse, we would probably go the same way as countries with lower coverage and lower union density and so on. But so far, at least for the blue-collar workers, I think it's we're doing what we should do.
Okay.
Trying to sign more collective.
Very short answer from Charlotte on research. Do you have any research on extending agreements and their effects?
No, but I agree that it's not a debate in Sweden, and I think it's because no one wants it.
Yeah, that is
That's the simple answer.
Yeah.
But I would also like to add that 98% of workers working in firms with more than 50 employees have collective agreements. So it's also not really like a big thing.
True.
As long as the wage increase is also binding for the others?
Yeah, I mean, I've done interviews with firms who don't have collective agreements, and it's remarkable how often they have one in the drawer that they use as the norm.
Are there in Sweden these guys hängavtal? So that there are some kind of pressure that those unorganized firms are
very common.
Yeah.
We need to finish now, 2 minutes over. But now it's lunch. Then you decide after lunch if you go back here or if you go to the Sandler room. Have a nice lunch for an hour. Thank you.
Thank you. Nice to meet you.